Hi, this is Dr. Vahid Aryadust. In a few videos, I'm going to discuss the concept of speaking and interactional competence. I'll be using a few references. The major references that I will use are these three. One by it's a book chapter by Bygate, published in 2009, Galaxy and Taylor, published in 2018, and finally Young in 2011, which is also a book chapter. So let's get started with the concept of speaking and also an overview of the content of these videos. I will discuss speaking, what it is, the nature of spoken languages, and also some of the pedagogical responses to speaking. Then I will talk about interactional competence, what it is, a very brief history of interactional competence, and then I will talk about two strands in interactional competence research with specific attention to the assessment of IC, or interactional competence. And then I discuss technological advances that help us engage our students, especially in the new normal, in speaking and interactional activity. So let's get started with the definition of speaking. Speaking, according to Galaxy and Taylor, is, from a sociological perspective, the primordial side of sociality. And from a cognitive psychology perspective, is something we are wired for. So, according to this perspective, humans are designed for dialogues rather than monologues. So what this indicates is actually speaking is a form of communication. We are able to speak because we need to communicate. So this is acceptable by those scholars who believe that communication is the main purpose of language, or using language. That includes production and comprehension of language, or perception of language. Now, on the other hand, there's a group of scholars like Noam Chomsky and people who believe in his theoretical frameworks, who argue that language originally was not developed or designed for communication, but it's a device for expressing our thoughts. In other words, it's a device for thinking. So it's not necessarily this statement that reads humans are designed for dialogues rather than monologues is not necessarily correct in the eyes of those people. In my opinion, I think a compromise can be made. We can say that while language first emerged as an instrument to express our thoughts, then it became, perhaps quickly became an instrument for communication. So I would say, first of all, the primary reason for language to emerge was expressing thoughts, whereas the secondary one was communication. Now, speaking is not necessarily an easy part of language learning, unlike what some people think. And this is because, especially in second language learning classes or foreign language learning classes, a lot of learners start to speak, and therefore it might give the impression that speaking is an easy part of language to learn, but it's not so. Speaking actually is a different kind of engagement with a foreign language, and therefore it requires different kinds of learning activities, which would be necessary for every teacher and educator to be aware of. Now, there are a few concepts that are discussed by Bygate. One of them is the formal patterns of spoken language as products. He argues that this is one of the factors that defines the nature of spoken language. The second factor to define this nature is the socio-psychological processes involved in generating spoken language. And finally, the internal qualities of spoken language, which are, as you see in this diagram, are fluency, complexity, and accuracy. So Bygate doesn't discuss complexity and accuracy in detail, but he discusses fluency in some detail. Now, what he doesn't discuss is the idea of neurocognitive processes of speakers, as well as the language capacity, which, according to Chomsky, is something that is wired in us. That's, in other words, it's in our DNA. Chomsky, as I have mentioned in other videos before, Chomsky argues that language is an object of biology. So here, by language, he means spoken language, the language that we produce and understand, rather than the language that we write and read. So language is in our DNA, meaning that pretty much like our capacity to grow, for example, limbs or internal body organs, we have a capacity to grow language, and it grows over time. Around the age of 3, it has reached an exponentially high level, such that kids can easily start a conversation with adults and express their thoughts clearly and eloquently. But of course, there are people who do not agree with this. One of the most important reasons for this is that we have not found any evidence to support this hypothesis so far. Now, but the second level, which is neurocognitive processes of language, is basically more supported by the available research. There is a lot of research that shows that language, this is the current orthodoxy in neurocognitive research, that shows or claims that language is lateralized in the left hemisphere, in the areas like Broca's area, Wernicke's area, inferior frontal gyrus, and some part of prefrontal cortex. In other words, these areas of the brain are associated with the production of language. And then we have those 3 levels, which I mentioned, which have been discussed by Gates, and I will try to go through these 3 levels and provide some information about them. And also, Gates discusses the pedagogical procedures in teaching speaking. He talks about the activities and their exploitation, and also the approaches to oral second language syllabus and its design and development and implementation. So let's see in some details what Gates is actually presenting in his models and frameworks. So this is the first table of his book chapter, which is actually an adaptation from Biber, Conard, and Leach, published in 2002. So these are some of the formal patterns of spoken language, which are purely descriptive. For example, if you look at a conversation between 2 people, you will probably be able to find out that there is a shared context in that conversation. And as a result of this shared context, these 2 interlocutors do not have to use clear references to what they're talking about. So they resort to using ellipses and proforms, with proforms being a word or a phrase that can take the place of another word or a group of words in a sentence, pretty much like what pronouns do. Then we've got deictic features. When you point to something and say this, that, those, these, that's a deictic feature. And it's interesting to know that deictic features are not specific to humans. Basically, some research shows that other primates, such as chimpanzees and bonobos, also use deictic features in their communications. Now, Gates goes on to say that in a conversation, in a verbal conversation, people or interlocutors avoid too much elaboration, unlike the written communication. So they frequently use pronouns. They use less noun phrase modification, and so on and so forth, as you see in this list. In addition, there is this element of interactiveness, which means that they use negative forms like not, no. For example, you might hear this from interlocutors, where they might say, no, I don't mean that, and those kind of negative things. But if you compare that with a piece of academic writing, you almost never find the word no in any written piece. So it might be a differentiating feature of spoken language. Now, there is this IR pair, initiation response. You say something, then the interlocutor says something. Actually, in second language learning or foreign language learning, this has become a fairly successful way of teaching communication, in which teachers engage their students in initiation, response, feedback, in a cycle that includes initiation, response, and feedback. So there is research that shows that some learners make some significant progress if they are involved in this kind of activity. Then we have attention signaling and vocatives, where attention signaling is like when you direct the attention of someone to something specific, for example, in that environment or in a different environment which is not immediately present. And vocatives are when you call someone by name or when you mention their titles, for example, doctor, sir, or endearments like baby, sweetie, and those kind of words. Then in some cases we have a considerable use of what I've called annoying words. In some dialects, especially I think with a certain group of people like teenagers, they keep using a word like. And it doesn't mean much in that context. It's probably one of the vaguest words that I've ever heard when it comes to those conversations. But it's used profusely by some people as they speak. Then we have the word stance, when you show your stance with someone. For example, when you're expressing endearment, interjections, exclamations, evaluative predictive adjectives, and stance adverbials such as precisely or maybe, perhaps, those kind of adverbials that show that you're taking a stance. For example, precisely because someone mentioned this, I do not agree with them. Precisely because of that. Or probably this is wrong. Or maybe we should do this. Or maybe we should do that. These kind of sentences are very common in conversations, at least in English. You can also think about other languages. I would really like the listeners and viewers of this video to think about other languages and to not just direct their attention only to English, because it would be nice to find out whether this list has some universality at all or not. Then it's real time. Spoken language is often real time, often because not always. Right now you're listening to me. Actually, it's not real time listening, right? It's a recorded message that you're listening to, thanks to the advances of technology. But when you're doing a conversation with someone, yes, that's real time. It has to be real time. As a result, there are disfluencies, there are repairs, and there are a lot of reduced forms that you use. Instead of I cannot do this, you might say I can't do this, I won't do this, and things like that. So there are restrictive and repetitive forms that you use. For example, simple forms, certain adjectives that are used in some conversations, like the word cool in some dialects, and so on. And then vernaculars, some kind of dialect variation that's used in different parts of the world. Now, over the last 20 years, research, specifically corpus-based research, has revealed more and more clearly many of the major characteristics of spoken language, some of which are presented in this table. And like I said, it would be nice to think about other languages to find out whether these are universal or exclusive to certain languages like Indo-European languages only, or can they be generalized to other languages. So while those characteristics are purely descriptive, there are other characteristics that go beyond just mere description, and they start to get at psychological levels and layers of speaking. Now, before I move on to that, I should preface the next topic of discussion by saying that spoken language is a window on language learning, and therefore a lot of researchers have try to distinguish between the patterns that are produced by native speakers of languages versus non-native speakers of that language. For example, if I'm learning Malay or Chinese as a non-native speaker, do I use the same sort of patterns, discourse patterns, grammatical structures when I'm talking about a particular topic compared with someone whose native language or whose mother tongue is, for example, Mandarin or is Malay or other languages? So this is something that has been looked into in corpus linguistics research. And therefore, exploration of a particular pedagogy, that's the use of oral tasks, can be informed by this kind of research, by this corpus linguistics research. Okay, then I'll later come back to interactional competence and I'll talk about that too. So like I said, while the previous table by Biber and his colleagues is purely descriptive, there are models and descriptions that discuss the psychology, actually socio-psychology of spoken language. One of the earliest models that was produced and continues to be cited is Levelt's model, which was presented in 1989. And this model includes three major processes. In other words, it operationalizes or conceptualizes, I should say, speaking as a three-level kind of process, cognitive process. One is the conceptual preparation or conceptualization of the idea, followed by formulation, and followed by articulation. So let's see what these three processes are.